Hello there. Right, so sorry, I'm on my own today. So we're kind of getting stuff ready. I'm just gonna. I've got my phone here, so if it looks like I'm distracted, it's just because I'm making sure that everything's working. Just drop us a comment if the audio is too quiet. I'll give us a turn up, so that's not a problem. We want to make sure that everyone can hear this and hear us clearly. If you can't see us properly, let us know in the comments, and we'll also give you a wave as well. We want to be kind of making this interactive. We're talking this morning about sexual relationships. This is part of our Kingdom Justice series on, we're looking at the sort of sex industry and porn industry and how that affects people in the church, our young people, and actually people of all ages realistically, because this is some subject that is had a profound impact on the church. And so we're going to be taking a little bit of a different approach to that today. What we're doing is next week we've got a interview with Dave and Sean Wade, the pastors at Bridge Church, and we're going to be looking at how pastorally we deal with the subject of pornography and how we seek to break those addictions, overcome them. But then today we're going to look at something slightly different. That sort of subject is going to tell us what things aren't, what is unhealthy, what's bad, and how we can overcome it. Today we want to look at what is a healthy sexual culture? What does healthy sexual culture look like within the church? What does it look like within our lives, within our marriages as well? How do we discuss that? And how do we create and cultivate those healthy sexual cultures? To discuss this, I have brought in someone who's a little bit close to home. It's someone who I think it's easier to talk about these things with people who we know well and trust. So I brought my brother, Joseph. He's my older brother and the wiser one as well, who's with us today. Joseph, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself, because a lot of people here who are watching probably won't know who you are and won't have met you before, but just share with us a bit about who you are, where you're at, and a bit about what's happening with you and Alive at the moment.
Yeah, as you say, I'm Joseph, and I am married to the lovely Megan, and we have a daughter called Evelyn, who is delightful.
She's amazing.
She is wonderful.
I can guarantee that.
And we have been living in Lincoln most of our lives, but Megan and I moved here about 5 years ago after we graduated. And yeah, we've been settled and alive ever since. We're helping to run the young adults team at the moment, which is really terrific. It's a great bunch of people, and we're excited to see Jesus really move and get to know people in a new way. So yeah, just excited to be a part of it, really.
Awesome. And I'm really blessed that you can come and speak to us today, just because I made a joke with you earlier, but you're one of these people. You're great in both the, as I put it earlier, the rehearsed and the unrehearsed speech. So you're great at coming up with answers to questions and talking through stuff. So that's perfect for this topic. And I know that we've discussed this a lot in the past, just because we're brothers. We've walked through so much together, and we've both got families now. So we're both in that place where we're looking at both our families, our relationships, and also within our church. Like you said, you're looking to sort of lead young adults. This is a subject that's so crucial to that. Setting up healthy cultures is a bedrock. It's part of our foundation. Sexuality is a huge part of life, and understanding how we view that in a way that is glorifying God is essential. So that's what we're going to be discussing today. I just want to say hi, Vicky. Thank you for letting us know. Hi, James, as well. And it's great to have you with us. Give us a shout, give us a wave if you are online and watching, and it would be nice to just say hi to you as well. If you've got any questions as well as we're talking, pop them in the comments. I am on Facebook. I haven't got it up on YouTube, but if you're on Facebook, drop a comment and I'll see if we can answer that as well, because we don't know how long this is going to go on for. It's kind of a little bit of a free thing at the moment. We're just seeing what happens, and it would be great to answer some questions as well. As long as they're not too inappropriate, we'll try and do our best. That we're still representing the church here, so we've got to kind of behave, you know what I'm saying? So I suppose where we're going to kick off with and start is, I mentioned earlier, we're having a conversation next week with Dave and Sean Wade. They're going to be looking at how people overcome addictions within pornography and how we deal with that in a pastoral way that doesn't pile shame on people, doesn't look at sort of synthesizing purity culture, which we're going to be discussing in a bit anyway. we're going to be talking about what, like, kind of the opposite of that in a sense, and some part of it, there may be a bit of back and forth and a bit of kind of going into that grey area, but we're going to be discussing what a healthy relationship looks like. So we'll start with this question, which is, what is a biblical standard for a sexual relationship? Because I think in today's culture, sexual relationships is almost, if you go by what society says, it's almost anything goes. It's so kind of, it's been kind of broken down into something that basically it says sexual relationships are often very meaningless. We talk about, there's a lot of films which kind of talk about casual sex, stuff like that. What is God's view of a healthy sexual relationship? Where is it founded?
Such a great question. I think it's something that I think is probably, it's notable and it's strange to a lot of people because it is so countercultural, and I think that is really where its beauty comes from. Because it really will seem strange to a lot of people who have lived in a culture where sex has been deconstructed, it's been kind of commercialized and sold and promoted as something that is entirely separate from both relationships in a serious way, but any kind of spiritual dimension. It's really been just kind of turned into something recreational. I don't think you need to look very close beneath the surface to see the harm that has done. But the depiction of sex that the Bible gives and that Christians can embody is something that's profoundly beautiful and life-giving, and doesn't have to be less fun. It doesn't have to be rigid and boring. And I think Christians actually should be people who, in a very appropriate way, for obvious reasons, exemplify what good sex looks like, by keeping it in a place that is holy, that is joyful, and that is affirming, and that is ultimately free. The Bible obviously puts sex in the context of the expression of a covenant between a man and a woman, and in some senses, maybe that language seems quite kind of cold and uninteresting in the context of sex, but sex in Scripture is ultimately both something God gives as a gift to his children to enjoy and to enrich them, but also something that signifies something deeper. It represents something even more significant and even more beautiful, which is that connection between the soul and God, between Christ and the church. And that might seem strange when you look at it on the surface, but it invests sex with real meaning. It says it's not something dirty, it's not something common, it's not something that you can just kind of enjoy like a game of tennis or marijuana or whatever you do recreationally.
Those are very different things.
Yeah,
like
very different
tennis
things.
and marijuana.
We
just
don't
went to
recommend
both
doing
ends.
those together, incidentally. But a lot of lost balls. But it would be... not, from what I've heard. But it's also something that is... It's a beautiful gift. And it's something that's wonderful in the context of marriage and has a deeper significance for what it symbolizes between God and the church.
Yeah, and I'm just going to go out on a limb here, and I'm going to state for the record, I think I should get an amen for this, but I think Christians should be having the best sex. So all societies and cultures, Christians should be having the best sex, because if we're doing it right, I'm not just talking about the physical act, but I'm talking about the bigger picture, relationships, sexual relationships, then if we're living in that place where we're working in accordance with how God created us to be, with how he created sexual relationships to be had, then we should have the healthiest, the most wonderful and intimate and meaningful sexual relationships, which is really what it's about in terms of sexual relationships. Who wants a second-rate sexual relationship? I know that Jesus doesn't want that for us. I know that when he created man and woman, when he created them for marriage, for essentially intimacy with one another, for unity, he looked and he said it was good. And so, yeah, I think we should get an amen for that, because if you're a Christian and things aren't great for you at the moment in that department, then just know that in God's plan, if you're married, I should give that caveat.
Yeah.
If you're married, then he intends for you to have a really good and healthy sexual relationship. And hopefully we can talk a little bit about how to, in some ways, how you can lay the spiritual foundation, not practical, the spiritual foundation for a healthy sexual relationship today.
That's a discussion for another time. I think for people,
Go and ask your mum and dad if you...
Or don't, actually, because that could traumatize you. So
we kind of grew up in that family culture. For a lot of people who know our Life Church family and those who don't, we're part of a large family. Joseph is the eldest child. I'm the second eldest. We're two of 13 children, and so my parents delight in kind of winding us up occasionally with I don't know, we're getting to that age where we can't really complain about it anymore as married people, but certainly when they were younger, whenever they were kissing, we'd be like, ugh, it's the gross. It's it's totally go away. We'll actually be talking a little bit about that later in terms of actually what a healthy relationship looks like. But that's a really good place to start. It's fundamentally between a man and a woman. You mentioned a word there which I think it would be useful to expand on and break down a bit. Covenant. What does that mean? And what does that have to do with sexual relationships? What is a covenant, and what does that mean for marriage?
Covenant is something that is, once again, it's a word that is used both in the context of relationship between men and women, and also the relationship between God and people. So God has covenants, which is sort of a solemn and unbreakable promise of loyalty and faithfulness to his people, and that is what we enter into in marriage. It's an exclusive promise that you will love and honor and cherish the other person. And I think it seems deeply old-fashioned to modern sensibilities, but I think the more we understand how significant sex is, how potent, how emotionally significant it is for people, both men and women, the more we understand the wisdom of enjoying that only in the safety of marriage, only in the safety of covenant, where you're not in a fluid relationship that could dissolve at any time, where you're motivated by self-interest. But sex is meant to exist as part of an expression of faithfulness, of love and kindness, so that you are saying, I'm not in this relationship for what I can get, which is really the root of exploitation, actually. That's kind of where pornography comes from. That's where sexual exploitation comes from, is viewing sex through the lens purely of self-interest. Whereas in covenant, in marriage, you are vulnerable with someone, and you are making yourself vulnerable, and they're being vulnerable with you, because it's a safe place, because you know you're not going to be abandoned, you know you're not going to be mistreated. And in that context, sex can be something that really flourishes. You can see the fullness of God's intention for it, not as something that is just a fling, something that was a bit of fun, although it's fun, it certainly should be, but as something also that bonds and unites people, and creates, in some cases, new life, but more often just intimacy and connection between two people who have committed to each other. And that probably sounds boring from the outside. I think if you've tried it, and if you've done it the way God invites us to do it, I don't think people who honestly try it are disappointed when it's practiced in the way that God intended. And there are obviously a lot of ways we can fall short of that. But when we do it the way God created us to, when it exists in that context, it's so life-giving. It's so, literally life-giving in some cases. But it's also something that kind of, in every aspect of life, can bring fullness and wholeness.
I can speak to that just even personally. So we're both married, and I think one of the things, we don't have time to really talk about it today, but one of the unhealthy parts of sexual culture is the male bravado. So every man wants to be kind of get a slap on the back and I'm great in bed, and they want to talk about that. And of course they do. It's kind of that kind of male bravado. It's part of culture, but actually, it's not a particularly healthy part of that culture. And the reality is, for all the best intentions and for all the banter and the joking, I can't speak to how whether it exists in amongst female social groups. I don't have that any experience of that, but I know certainly for men, actually, sex can be quite a it's a huge deal, and especially when someone's entering into a sexual relationship for the first time. There are a lot of things to both learn and emotionally process as well. It's when done in a healthy way, you're sharing something totally intimate. You are totally bare before another person. Like, there's no like hiding from it. You can't. It's not like porn. It's not hiding behind a screen and it being one-sided. You're sharing your most intimate self with another person, and actually, when that's not done in marriage, it can really have a destructive effect. I think it's what drives part of our culture around how to be like have good self-worth. You've got to look a certain way. You've got to fulfill a certain criterion, like your looks, how you do things, and that's really not very good. I'd hate to think that I was someone, I left an encounter of something like that, and then people were talking about me, or that I was being kind of like almost rated, which is something that happens a lot in sexual culture. And so actually, I'm married to Rebecca, and being able to grow sexually together and sorry, Rebecca, if this is too much information, but sort of go on that journey together and learn. It's actually a real safe place, and it's really good and wholesome. That's how God intended it to be, right? We're able to share that with someone who, like you said, they're not going to just walk out. They're not gone the next day. They're with you. They're not there to judge you, and actually you're there working through that together and sharing that journey together, and that's something really special. And I remember when me and Rebecca were first married, I just remember being really thankful that actually I got to get to spend my life with her, but also share in this journey with her as we grow in intimacy together, and we learn more about each other and what we like and what we don't like, and that's been a real valuable process, and I think something that is overlooked and kind of almost snubbed in a lot of culture today, as kind of monogamy is seen as like it's old-fashioned. It's not particularly, it's not a great thing. But yeah, there's that. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or whether you want to move on to our next point.
I mean, you raised so many good questions and points just in that one little explanation. I think listening to people kind of who are unhappy in a kind of secular context of sex, I think all the things they report as being problems you can trace back to betraying the beautiful intention of God. The fact that so many women feel that they are simply sought out and used by men for nothing else, because that original design of sex has been perverted and lost, because it was never meant to exist as an abstract thing. It was meant to be a holistic thing that existed in a social and a spiritual and a physical union. And obviously it should be stated as well that it would be really naive to think that once you are married, all of your problems simply dissolve, because obviously we bring our inhibitions, we bring our fears into marriage. But it is to say that when we surrender our marriages to God and say, God, what do you intend for this relationship? How do you envisage it looking? What does a healthy emotional intimacy and sexual intimacy look like? When we yield that to him, then that marriage can become something truly beautiful, and we're all on a journey, so to speak, in which we haven't realized that yet. And for a lot of people, they might think, well, I am married and it isn't all that great, but that doesn't discredit God's original purpose and design, because as we surrender to it, and as we're molded by him, because he knows what will make us happy, he knows what will make us flourish as people and as couples, we will find those problems begin to dissolve. We will find those fears and those inhibitions and those things that divide us can be resolved. And simply knowing that that's God's intention, that God designs us for marriages that are fulfilling sexually, that are fulfilling emotionally, romantically, and simply knowing that that is God's purpose and intention can help us, whether we feel we're quite close to it or a million miles away, to know that it exists, and you can find people, you don't need to look very hard, who are living that life, who are exhibiting what a healthy and happy marriage looks like. Yep. So it should be an encouragement wherever you are at the moment. It's not out of reach, and God is so eager and so willing to help us live in that flourishing place.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just to add on to that, if that point that you just made about what we take into marriage is something that you're interested in discussing more, next week when you're going to be able to view our interview with Dave and Sean Wade, who are pastors at Bridge Church, we're going to be talking a little bit more about that because, as Joseph's alluded to, there is this kind of belief, and luckily I think it was something that actually someone had kind of busted that myth in my mind before I got married. But a lot of people think, well, once I get married, it won't be a problem. I'll have emotional security, physical security, pornography won't be an issue, or all those like sort of desires for sex won't be an issue because I'll have, a husband or I'll have a wife, and so it's all great. And actually that's not the case. But we're going to be discussing a bit about what Jesus says about that and how we can deal with that healthily next week. So I definitely recommend you tune in for that as well. Let's talk about purity culture. So we grew up both in the 90s, early 2000s, and the church has changed an awful lot. Even before we were born, there was the start of the purity culture, and I think it started in the States and it kind of came across to the UK. There was a real emphasis placed around sexual purity above all else, which kind of is ironic to me because growing up, my parents did a great job. They were phenomenal parents.
My parents did too, for what it's worth.
Yeah, that's our parents. I'll rephrase it. But but one of the interesting things is that we were still part of that church culture, and things have changed in the same way. Like growing up, Harry Potter was like, as part of our church culture, was like, no, do you want to be infested with demons? And now we're like, oh yeah, okay, it's pretty chill, it's okay. In the same way, back then there was this massive thing about like purity within our sexuality. It didn't really. I don't know if you have a different recollection. It didn't really transpire to other areas of our life. So they weren't so bothered if you were like passionately in love with Jesus, as long as you didn't sleep with another person until you were married. That approach, that's religion, that's purity culture, and it's not actually of God in the sense that it aims what it's trying to do is good. But it's synthetic. It's a man-made attempt at purity, and it misses purity. It misses the bullseye, which is purity and holiness, and it settles for piety instead. So let's just talk about that a bit in church and in families. Let's start with the family, and then we'll kind of graduate out a little bit further than that and go on to the church. But just within family culture, we shared the same upbringing, which is one of the reasons why it's really useful to be able to have you on, because we can have a shared experience in that and discuss it. And we're also both fathers now in our own right, although our children are very young, so it's still a while before we're going to be having any sort of conversations of those things, hopefully a long time. But where do we start with what are some of the things that are healthy in a sexual culture in a family, like that kind of essentially that stop or guard against purity culture? Does that make sense? So what should a healthy culture, a sexual culture in a family look like to you? I know that's like a massive bombshell of a question. If you need any time to process that, that's cool. But
I think shame is probably a topic we will exposit more fully in this conversation, because I think I want to return to this because it's such a significant hurdle to understanding what God wants for healthy sexuality. I think avoiding shame and putting love and acceptance in its place is one of the best ways that we can explore and understand sexuality without falling into the many pitfalls. I think understanding that the devil has done a great deal to pervert sex from both ends of the spectrum. So he's very interested in stigmatizing it, making it taboo, making it something you don't talk about, something that is dirty and shameful. And then he's also done a great deal of work to essentially rid it of all of its beauty and its sacredness, and turn it into something that is basically, it's no big deal. It is, like, as they say, like a game of tennis. and essentially that you can kind of explore it without any limitation, without any regard for other people, and that it's essentially all fair game. And both of those perspectives hurt people. Both of those perspectives mar the beautiful intention of God, and ultimately mar the fun, because they're not allowing sex to exist in a healthy place. And I think being aware of both of those as Christian families and parents, we're maybe aware of one or the other, perhaps more of an awareness of don't let children think that promiscuity is a good thing, but it's equally important that we don't use language and we don't kind of talk about it in a way that would suggest this is a topic we don't talk about, or if we must, it should be in hushed tones, and then moved on as quickly as possible. And I just think, like, following the model that God gave, and that you see exhibited in the kind of the Hebrew communities in the Old Testament, where sex was a normal part of life. Obviously, it was considered.
They had a calendar for it, for heaven's sake.
Yeah.
It was pretty ingrained.
And it was something that was healthy, and obviously, there was a degree of privacy, which is not the same as shame in any sense. But it also wasn't something that needed to be concealed. It wasn't harmful for people to know about it or to talk about it. And I think in that context, you remove a lot of the desirability of sex when children are younger, in a sense that it stops being kind of the forbidden fruit that they know that they're not supposed to want or talk about. And that obviously makes it more attractive to a human being. It's probably not dissimilar to the sort of French model of alcohol consumption, where they introduce alcohol to much younger people, and it's kind of assimilated into their life as an ordinary thing, and as a result there isn't this veneration for alcohol as this huge thing, so that when you reach like 16 or 17 you have to have it, and I think as a result on the continent they don't have the same drinking problems, at least in the young, I would think, because it isn't kind of separated off as this big thing that you're not supposed to talk about or have until you're old enough.
Yeah.
And I think, just removing the stigma and the shame, expressing that this is something that God designed to be beautiful and good, and it's supposed to exist like all things in a certain context. You're not supposed to just do it anywhere, anytime, with anyone, but that doesn't make it a bad thing.
Yeah.
And if we can just begin to do that, I think how we deal with sex in the church would be hugely improved.
Shame is an absolute killer, because I remember growing up and my parents gave us the talk. I was probably like 8, and because I think it was being discussed in school, and I think a lot of people who are watching, I can see there's a couple of parents at the moment who are watching, and say hi, by the way. If you've got any questions about what we're asking, pop them in the comments and we'll try and answer them. But I remember when I was about 8, we had the talk, but I think maybe where, like, one area where it was, every personality is different, but that talk was quite vague, and maybe our parents, I think they did a phenomenal job, to be honest, but one of the areas where they felt they were protecting us is by kind of being quite scarce and trying to give us like an overview, which, to be fair, at 8, that's probably not a bad thing. But as I got older, because there was no development on that, and we didn't really discuss it, it left me with a lot of questions, and those questions fueled kind of like I needed to understand and I needed to know, particularly for teenagers, as their bodies are going through changes and they're starting to feel like what's happening, why is this happening, and what are all these things for that God has given me. I think it's useful to take away the shame and actually create a culture, which actually happened as I got older, and our family grew, and we had more brothers and sisters. Those conversations became more common, which actually only created an even more healthy environment in which to talk about it. But certainly when I was younger, I would have been mortified to go and ask like a parent or an adult, like, I don't quite understand sex, could you explain it a little bit more? And that was something that's, I think, we need to stop in church. One thing that I will say, and I think this is for the church as well, showing affection in marriage is so important. Children learn from what they see. When we're And I do this with, the most common thing I associate this with is worship. So I want my children to grow up knowing Jesus, having a powerful and transforming relationship with Jesus, in which they go out into the world and take the good news to him. And they do that by cultivating a lifestyle of worship. How do I get them to worship? How do I get them to know that that's a lifestyle that's worth doing? We demonstrate it. Me and Rebecca make sure that we don't hide our worship. We don't make it a private affair. Worship is a common part of our household. So the boys, my boys Ezra and Solomon, they've grown up with seeing how we worship, how we are made vulnerable before God, how we cry and we laugh and we jump up and down as we're worshipping and praying. So that kind of gets the culture of normality. In the same way, and I'm not suggesting this on the sexual side of things, that would be wildly inappropriate. But what I am saying is, sexual relationships don't just start and end in the bedroom. They're actually it's a culture thing that kind of goes through our lives. Your whole marriage is a sexual relationship, in the sense that when you're cooking together, when you're getting dressed in the morning, when you're making dinner and cleaning the house, all those things are actually that your relationship is still there, and it's a sexual relationship by nature of the fact that if you're married or together. One of the things that I think is really important is being able to show physical affection in front of your children. So I always like to make sure, just as a personal thing, that my boys see that I love to give Rebecca hugs. We kiss regularly, try to be physically affectionate, because they then say, "Oh, this is like how a healthy marriage looks. This is like in my case, how a husband treats his wife. He's affectionate, he's kind, and it also gets them to recognize that actually it's a good thing." And I think as long as there's boundaries put in, so that they know that you can't just go and do that to other people and like be affectionate. I think children recognize and pick up on subtleties in a lot of these things. They recognize that it's between mummy and daddy, and that daddy doesn't do that to any other woman. I think that's the key point. But I think that's really important. I think a lot of people say, well, that's not my love language. That may be. I know that people have different ways of expressing affection and showing love. I still think it's important that people demonstrate that love, because children need to see that their parents have a physical relationship, and that actually that's okay. Because I think when we strip it out and we just make it very, I don't know, I've certainly known couples where it's kind of very almost like prim and proper outside of the bedroom. It kind of just creates, I think it reinforces that stigma that like physical affection, touching, showing affection is all like, that's a dirty thing. We don't show that in front of people. It's stigmatized. That belongs in the bedroom. You don't touch, people are kissing, that's gross. Now, obviously there's limits. We're not advocating, what's it called in the workplace where it's
Sexual harassment.
Well, no, not the sexual harassment.
Exhibition,ism, anything like that. Well, like
too much like public affection, displays of public affection is what I was thinking of. But we're not advocating for that. There's been a couple of questions that have come through that we'll just take a moment to answer. So someone has asked, I'm not going to use your name because I'm assuming people can see in the comments, but I don't want to use your name without your permission. Someone's asked, how does God feel about people that aren't married that have children? Do you want to answer that? I'm just going to shoot that.
Just throw the grenade in my direction. Yeah, I mean, in one sense, like how people who have children outside of marriage, like that makes no difference to the love of God. Like it's so important not to even subconsciously divide people into groups who are less loved or
Amen.
less significant or less welcome. I would say that it's countercultural, but I think we can recognize that to have children outside of marriage is something that creates challenges and stress for the people who actually have those children. And those people, the children and the parents, are so deeply loved by God. And it's so important that we don't let their decisions or our decisions, if it's us, come in between us and God, or how we treat them. But I think it is significant, I think, even just to be, for example, a single parent, or to be married, not married, and to have those children, it creates difficulties, it creates tensions, there are vulnerabilities there. And I think to actually go through it yourself or to walk through someone who has that, I think they will testify there are challenges here, and we can begin to see why God intended it to happen in the context of marriage. We can't change what's happened, and so there's absolutely no point in dwelling in shame on the decisions that were already written in stone. God is so redemptive, so that when we come to him, and whether we've had a string of sexual relationships, whether we've had a child before marriage, those are not obstacles to coming to him. He loves us so fiercely and so passionately. But it's also really significant for us to find freedom by acknowledging when we've done things in a way that isn't the way God intended. And we often will see the fruit of that in daily life. Like, I've made decisions in life where, in retrospect, I think, God said to do things one way, and I can see so clearly now why he wanted it to happen that way. And once children are in the world, we should, be so careful never to let that language affect how they feel, because they are created by God and they're welcomed into the world. The circumstances of how it happened might not be in line with what God intended. But again, it's so important that we resist shame and we remember that people are valued and loved, and that God is redemptive, and that there is forgiveness for everything. That's probably quite a rambly response. But
I once heard Chris Valentin say that unless an answer to a question was a redemptive answer, so unless it brought you closer to Jesus and more into freedom, then it probably wasn't the answer that Jesus gave, which I really like. I'd agree with what you said there. I think there's nothing that's an obstacle there to what God wants to do. I think God gives, he kind of gives the patent, he gives the design and says, this is what I created for it to be great and for you to have everything to its fullest. I think a lot of our lives in general actually aren't in line with exactly what God would want it to be. It doesn't stop God from working through us or using us. It doesn't stop us from being blessed and being loved. There's not a reason for casting judgment or shame. It's just a recognition that God's saying, if there are going to be inevitable struggles if you do it in a particular way. But I think I hope that's helped. There's another question as well. And it says, this is interesting, it touched on a point that you made sort of fairly near the beginning. It says, surely there is a difference between sex and making love. Sex is just an act, whereas making love is a joining of heart, mind and body, where women are more valued in society and by themselves. They will be more likely to just have the life partner. So the difference between making love and sex. Firstly, I do think that there is a kind of there isn't a difference.
I think it's probably one of those semantic differences where it depends really on the meaning you ascribe to that word, and different people will bring different meanings to those words. They mean a lot of things to a lot of people, I suppose. But I think insofar as if you want to use the term making love, that term probably includes more of an emotional aspect. It includes commitment, it includes safety, it includes commitment and acceptance. And those are all really important things. And maybe in the context of wider society, the word sex on its own maybe is quite unstructured, maybe includes a lot of things that for some people are quite negative, and includes ideas that God doesn't love, that are things that don't enrich us and nourish us. But I think it's probably also important to make sure that we do reclaim those words that are biblical. So I think there should be an overlap, and I would say it's probably good to reclaim the word sex from the kind of realm of something that is just a worldly understanding of just a transaction, a bit of fun, whatever, and that we actually restore it to its biblical meaning. And because it's so much better and so much healthier.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that. I get what they mean in the sense that there are times when I think people, I think that there is I get the approach where we sort of think sex is like the physical act. It's just a thing, and then making love is a far more you're doing exactly the same thing, but it's about your intention, your commitment. There is something, and I think it can describe different sexual encounters within the same relationship. I think there are some times when you can have sex, and then sometimes when you can make love. But ultimately, what I think you're saying is, if I'm right, they're the same thing. It's just that actually the way in which we approach it and how we understand and use that word we've ascribed different meanings to them, but actually they should be the same thing.
Yeah, and I think it's important as well that we don't bring into a biblical understanding of sex a kind of romantic in the old sense, not romantic in the sense of romance, but the old sort of poetic romantic thing. The idea that what makes sex holy is the emotion behind it, which isn't true. What makes sex holy is the covenant that it exists in. Once you have said, I do, once you commit to that person and you share a life together, there isn't a kind of an emotional dance that has to happen with every sexual union. And as John said, like, married people know, to put it very bluntly, there are a lot of different ways to have sex. It doesn't, sometimes it should be, something that is savored, that is deeply emotional, that is, sometimes it can be more reconciliation, sometimes it can be consolation, sometimes it can just be fun. And I think the thing that makes it holy is that it exists in the context of that promise of marriage, and not to make it so sacred that it almost needs to be approached with holiness, like it's kind of like this great performance, and the stars need to be just right, and the moon must be at the right trajectory. And I understand where that comes from, because people don't want to see sex cheapened and made something that's just coarse and vulgar, and that's completely right. But we also don't want to swing to an extreme in which sex becomes almost a performance. And yeah, it is the covenant that makes it holy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a bit of a weird detour, but I'm just going to take it anyway, because we'll see what happens.
Why not?
But I actually once compared, and bear with me here before you accuse me of like heresy. I have got a point to this, so please don't like all switch off and start throwing stuff at your screens. So I actually once compared the Eucharist, so communion, to sex, in that sex is exists in a covenant of marriage. The reason why it exists is for security, loving security. It's a promise made to each other, and it becomes a safe environment in which to raise children, which is usually, not always, there's no hard and fast ones, but it's often the result of a marriage or that relationship. And we were having a conversation about regularity, and about like, well, how often is like sex, because there was a couple that we used to know, and we were kind of laughing. They were sort of a fairly new couple, and they were like, oh, John, this was before I was married, they're like, it goes downhill. It's like, and she was laughing. She was like, he gets it once a month if he's lucky. And I was like, whoa, if that's what I have to look forward to, that's a real downer. Like I'm kind of, that sucks. I don't want that. And actually, I was thinking about this thing of it being something like special and holy. We associate, and I think wrongly, special and holy with infrequent and like kind of like a rarity. It's like it's a unique thing. And actually, we don't treat our moments of intimacy with God, we don't treat like that. Like, if we could be having multiple quiet times a day where we encountered God in power, then why wouldn't we? And the reason why I bring in communion is because communion is the physical representation of, certainly in the traditional sense of communion, of taking Christ into ourselves. So we take his body and his blood, and we remember him and his sacrifice. And in the Catholic literature, at least, and theology, it's known as a sacrament. So it's actually the physical means of communicating an incommunicable grace unto ourselves. And what that just means is it just means that we're making physically manifest something that is intangible, which is God's grace to us. And there's never a rule where we say, well, like, okay, actually, I have to correct that. Some churches do say, like, you only have communion once a year. I think that's rubbish, and I'll just go on record. I think that's a load of nonsense. I think communion should be something that you celebrate regularly, that you love to celebrate. And if we have those times of intimacy with God, and we say that that's a good thing, that we should have that, and it's a holy and it's a pure and right thing, within the context of marriage and it being consensual, sex is great. Have it as much as you can and as much as you want. It's a good thing. Why not? God created you for unity with this person. Celebrate by doing what he created you biologically to do, and have good sex, and take away the stigma on that.
I think it's important as well. I mean, I'm trying to figure out how to unpack the idea of shame and inhibition, because it feeds into a lot of different topics, and so I kind of want to touch on as many of them as I can because they're so significant. One is that children will pick up on these things. We don't need to tell children that sex is shameful. If we think it is, they will discern that from the way we act, the way we talk.
So good.
And you may not have ever said that to your children, like I hope I never will. But they can tell from the way that we sometimes avoid the subject, the way that we use certain words or don't use certain words. We'll all communicate to that child, this is how we talk about this or don't talk about it.
That's really good.
So it's really important that we invite God into that process of dealing with our own fears and inhibitions about sex, fundamentally for our sake and for the sake of our marriages, but also for the children that we're raising. And the reasons for that are manifold. But ultimately, I think it probably depends which route you take to the church. There are people who've probably come to the church from a secular context, and for them maybe they're very uninhibited and sex needs to actually be kind of brought in a little bit, and understanding that this is what is healthy sexuality and what isn't, adding some structure, adding some boundaries in order for sex to flourish for them. For a lot of people who've maybe grown up in the church and in a culture that was more inhibited and embarrassed about sex, I think the taboos surrounding sex are very deeply buried, and I don't know if they often get addressed because we've kind of, even if we don't say that it's a bad thing, we feel embarrassed by it sometimes. We don't like to talk about it. And I would really encourage people, as we should in every area of our lives, but sex is an especially important one, invite the Holy Spirit in to enlighten us and to deconstruct the ideas we have maybe brought to the table. Things we've maybe picked up from childhood, from bad experiences, just from bad teaching in some
Pornography.
cases. And ideas, well, in both senses, both about like perversions of sexuality, but also the stigma attached to sexuality. And I think sometimes we, in our marriages, don't really explore it because maybe at the back of their minds, people think, well, this, we don't want to make this dirty and obscene. And I think, for me personally, I was a fairly uninhibited person, but when I was married for the first time, and that
for the first time, Megan, if you're watching this, that's on record.
Married, I should say. You have to kind of ask and understand, like, when your ideas of what's healthy in sex, what's normal, what's biblical. I had to ask Jesus and be like, how much of this have I got from you, and how much have I just picked up from other places? Like, I studied theology. I've listened to these talks in a lot of Christian contexts, and some of the answers surprised me. And I think sometimes we can maybe come to sex with a view that is, yes, sex is good, but it's all very buttoned down and we don't talk about it, and it's great, for like that once a week reunion or whatever. And the idea of exploration, the idea of play, the idea of actually exploring sex with your spouse, if that feels a little bit intimidating or a bit embarrassing, I would suggest that actually there are maybe lies we've picked up from the enemy. Just taboos and inhibitions and things that might offend us might not offend Jesus, and also vice versa. But not bringing our preconceived ideas to marriage, but allowing the Holy Spirit to teach us how to think, even about small things. Like, it's really important to know that God is not squeamish about sex, and we shouldn't be. And I won't offend pious ears by using explicit language in this context. But even just biological terms, even words that are, they're not profane and they're not kind of blasphemous words, but some people get very sort of hot under the collar. And I would say, where does that come from? Because there's nothing in the Bible that would teach us that the words to describe our body, the words to describe sex, should be limited to dictionary definitions only, sort of the encyclopedia, or just very, very vague euphemisms. And I would suggest that mostly comes down to shame, actually, not holiness. And we don't need to be provocative, we don't need to be obscene, we don't need to sort of make a show of things. But I do think if we feel embarrassed and we say, oh, I don't really want to use those words or say those things or have that discussion, invite the Holy Spirit to enter that conversation, because God is not embarrassed. He isn't kind of, when the lights turn off, he's not like, oh my goodness, like I didn't know this was going to be happening. I don't. He created sex. He created the human body in all of its wonderful majesty and complexity and embarrassment. So I think
that's the first thing to be lost, isn't it? Because in the Garden of Eden, let's be honest, they were both naked. Adam saw Eve and was like, "Whoa, like she's great. You've created her for me." God created sexual union, and it says, for this purpose, a man will leave his father and mother and be joined, and they'll become one flesh. And we don't know how much time elapsed between that state of perfection in the garden and when sin entered the world. But we know the first thing to enter the world was shame, when man was covering up his own nakedness. Previous to that, I think that their sexual relationship would have been open. They would not even have considered it. So we know for a fact that shame was one of the first things to enter as a result of sin, and incidentally, shame of their sexual image, how they portrayed their nakedness. I'm not saying we go around being nude and to try and go back. There are some people who have said that. I definitely do not advocate that. Please don't go and take what I'm saying out of context. But what I am saying is that shame is one of those things that we have to break down. And so important, I think we've got to wrap up soon, but so important to this conversation is there are no areas of your life that Jesus doesn't want to have a say on. There's no areas of your life where Jesus doesn't have thoughts on. And sex, how you do sex, when you do sex, what you think about sex, is so important, like you said, to ask the Holy Spirit what he thinks. You talked about things that were from childhood and the things of shame that we bring into sex. I know as well, in line with our topic for this month, there's a lot of people, and I speak... our dad is calling us. Hopefully he's not telling us off for discussing this. There are so many people, and I speak from kind of my own experience, but also I think on behalf of 99.9% of men, I think it is, who have watched pornography. We'll talk about this more next week, but pornography twists sex. It presents a sham version of what God intended it to be, stripped of all meaning and love, and act genuine intimacy. And the problem is, though, that creates an expectation. Subconsciously, it sends us all sorts of messages. Even if, I don't know where people who are watching this at the moment, if you've watched porn or if you still watch porn, but you can even say, well, I know that, it's all fake, and we say it's all fake, we know that it doesn't actually, it certainly doesn't often look like that, and it's all done for, it's acting. But actually, even when we say, oh, we know it's all fake, there's a lot of stuff that goes in that we still kind of oh yeah, but I kind of assumed that was real, and about sexual relationships. And there's a huge amount of stuff that we have to then go back to God and say, actually, God, what's not of you? What have I learnt from the world about what standards have I taken from the world rather than from you? Because I think God has a whole different standard for sexual culture and for sexual practice within marriage. Because like I said before, he wants you to have good sex, especially if you're a Christian and you're married. He wants you to have good, fulfilling sex that brings you closer to your spouse, that is joy-giving, is life-giving, creates more love between you and your partner. And if that's not the case, I think it's one of the best things you can do is go to God and say, actually, I know that you want this for me as well. You're interested in this. This is not something that you're like, whoa, okay, guys, I'm not gonna, I'm not looking. He's aware. He knows everything about you already, and it's useful to go to him and say, what do you think about this? Because he is interested. Do you have any closing thoughts before we finish for this afternoon? I was about to say this morning, this afternoon.
Yeah, I think and this is, I think I touched on this earlier. This is advice that is so important for every sphere of life, but as you said, applying it to sexuality is equally important, and that is inviting the Holy Spirit to teach us how to think about this. Don't make assumptions. There are ideas that we carry with us, ideas, from both ends of the spectrum about shame, but also kind of from unhealthy sexuality that the devil has perverted. And ultimately, when we are surrendered to Jesus, when we are living the way he has designed us to, and that's not just external, that's internal, that's how we process, it's how we think, it's how we look at people, real flourishing can happen. And I would liken it to a plant, actually, which is a plant. Most plants need specific conditions to really flourish. You can put a plant in, a bad soil in the wrong conditions, and it might grow, and it might reach a certain height. But you can tell by looking at it, not all the conditions are met. This needs to be in better soil. It needs to have the right amount of water, the right amount of sunlight, and human beings are like that spiritually. Like, as we align ourselves to the purposes and the principles of God, as we listen to his voice, as we think how he thinks, real life can take hold. Like anxiety,
Amen.
freedom, sin, all of that can be dissolved and broken off as we align ourselves with the freedom that God designed us to live. And I would just say as well, like, and this is probably, I don't want to encroach too much on next week's subject, because I'm sure they're going to have like some really, really revelatory things to say. But I will say, like, for people who are either married happily, married unhappily, or single and, maybe struggling with pornography, the ideal that God presents us, that the flourishing life that he calls us to, can feel unattainable, particularly people who are single and want to be married but aren't. And the invitation to sexual purity, I can understand, because I felt it myself when I was younger. The crippling thing is almost the sense that you're going to live your life just constantly chasing this, and it's always just going to be a burden that you carry for your entire life. And it's not true. You can go through life fighting, and it feels like you're winning battles but never winning the war. But actually, that's a symptom that we haven't yet fully been changed and transformed by the love of God. And while sexual temptation will always exist in some forms, as we are made more in the image of Jesus, as we are freed from wrong ways of thinking, we actually can really enjoy life and live it fully, whether we're married or unmarried, whether sex is everything you hoped, or whether you're not anywhere near it. To live as God calls us to live is freedom. And if you're feeling that frustration and that sense of, I'm never going to be happy in my situation, that's an invitation to get to know God better and to be fulfilled and satisfied in him. Because as we do that, we'll discover, actually, regardless of where I am and what I have to learn, I can live a full and joyful life now. It doesn't have to wait until my sexual situation has been corrected or whatever you think. So there is absolutely hope, and God calls us to fullness of life now. So don't settle for anything less.
Amen. And we will be talking a bit more about that next week on Tuesday at 2 p.m. Like I said, I'll be having myself, Dave Wade and Sean Wade, pastors at Bridge Church, with me, and we're going to be talking about how people can get free from pornography and how we deal with that pastorally. Thank you so much for watching, those of us who you've been joining through. Thank you for your questions as well. They were really valuable. Fantastic questions. And thank you again to Joseph as well for agreeing at very short notice, I have to say, for coming to discuss this with me and sharing his thoughts. It's been really valuable. Hopefully you have found it valuable. I want to bless you guys. Have a good week. And bear with me, because I've got to go to the computer and manually end the stream. But have a great week, guys, and God bless. Goodbye.